Aloha from the East West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning into today's Gals with A Global webinar, Leading from the Frontlines of Change. Gals with A Global leverages the Center's unique access to the world's policymakers, entrepreneurs, community leaders, and artists, virtually uniting these global forces with Hawaii's women leaders to harness their collective experience, ambition, and passion. Gals with A Global is intentionally dynamic and interactive. We will begin with our keynote panel, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Open space will follow Q&A as an optional opportunity for attendees to meet the speakers at virtual roundtables and participate in an unmoderated and informal dialogue for 10 minutes. Open space is a unique opportunity to engage and network as peers with our esteemed speakers and your fellow attendees. We encourage our audience to participate in and take advantage of the access open space provides. My name is Sarah Lamb, and I am the Gals with A Global Coordinator. It's my pleasure to introduce the veterans and active duty women who will be discussing leveraging specific skills and experiences in transitioning their careers, self-advocacy, and encouraging employers to source a more diverse talent pool. A retired Major General with 34 years of service, Suzanne Puanani VARES-LUM took office as president of the East West Center in 2022. She is the first woman and Native Hawaiian to be chosen for this role and brings with her several decades of executive leadership and planning experience, including 5 years serving with and advising senior officials at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Gloria JUMAMIL-MERCADO is Undersecretary in the Office of the Presidential Advisor on Streamlining Government Processes for the Republic of the Philippines. Gloria was first commissioned to the Armed Forces of the Philippines in 1993 and in 2017 became the first woman to serve as Commodore for the Philippine Navy Reserve. Micheline Big Man is member of the Crow tribe and served in the U.S. Army from 1987 to 2009. She currently serves as founder and president of Native American Women Warriors, a nonprofit organization bringing recognition to women veterans of Native descent that have served in the armed forces. Jen Whitworth is a consultant who supports gender mainstreaming activities in security sector organizations. With 41 years of service in the Australian Defence Force, she has experience in leadership, organizational change, and large-scale cultural and gender workplace reforms. She is also chair of Women Veterans Australia and author of Against the Wind: How Women Can Be Their Authentic Selves in Male-Dominated Professions. And now I would like to take a moment to share our webinar protocols. Today's keynote panel is on the record, recorded, and will be made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Each panelist will speak for up to 7 minutes. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off during the keynote. If you're experiencing difficulty with internet connectivity, AirMeet provides a low-definition option at the bottom right of your screen. For the best attendee experience, please connect to AirMeet using the most up-to-date version of a Chrome browser. The webinar is also accessible through AirMeet's mobile app, available to download to any iPhone and Android device. Q&A will take place after panelists' remarks. To submit a question, use the Q&A function at the right of your screen. In either case, please specify which panelist you wish to answer. If you don't have a question of your own, you can also vote for a question asked by a fellow attendee. Questions with the most votes will be prioritized. Once Q&A concludes, viewers will have the option to meet our speakers by taking a seat at any virtual roundtable of your choosing and participating in an unmoderated and interactive discussion. We encourage you to share the space and your voice. Also join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag GalsWithLay and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, Tippy Kogan. Tippy is a former Army Airborne chaplain who retired after 20 years of service and a critical spinal cord injury sustained in Afghanistan. As an EQ advisor and employee engagement consultant, Tippy currently educates organizations on the importance of workforce wellness and spiritual development. She is also pursuing a doctorate in somatic psychology. And with that, I'll hand over the program to our moderator to offer brief contextualizing remarks. Tippy?
Aloha and welcome everyone. You are indeed in the right place for today's seminar, Leading from the Front Lines of Change. And after hearing about our lineup of speakers, I am so looking forward to diving into today's topic. Thank you, EWC, for planning another well thought out event and for inviting me to be today's moderator. Truly a pleasure and a gift. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Tippy Kogan, and I'll be guiding us through today's discussion, followed by Q&A and concluding release into our open space for group table discussions. Okay, but first, indulge me. Let us first settle into the space by sharing one collective breath for peace, harmony, and centering. Lower your gaze, roll back your shoulders, unfurl your brow, and breathe in deeply for 1, 2, 3. Hold at the top and exhale with a big, loud Perfect. I know you guys participated. Well done. Before I turn it over to our first speaker, President Lum, please allow me to briefly introduce myself, followed by the vision for today's session. As mentioned, I'm your moderator, and I'm here to help fill the gaps in the contextual bio, or excuse me, I'm here to fill in the textured gaps of my bio. I'll start by provoking a thought in you that was most recently asked of me. The question was, why would a peacekeeper go to war? I had to think about it for a moment. I mean, what would take an egregiously neglected, underweight teen from our Hanabata days at Washington Intermediate and Kaimaki High to a humble but challenging 20-year career navigating male-dominated environments full of misconduct, inequality, the hazardous conditions of 2 war campaigns, Arctic parachute jumps in Alaska, to draping flags over the coffins of fallen service members? To that, I had to reply, what better place for a peacekeeper to be? So, as a retired Army chaplain and forever humanitarian, I now go to war healing generational and institutional wounds, and am spearheading a systematic trauma healing initiative called Hold the Door, advocating for equitable access to quality placements, competitive pay, and mental health support for BIPOC clinicians and clergy, the bedrock of our communities, our healers. And what a better place for you to be than to be here with us, the perfect segue into our seminar topic, Leading from the Front Lines of Change, where we'll hear how a few phenomenal female leaders leverage their unique experience serving organizations and nations, helping to prime their current roles. We'll also receive a candid look into the many struggles and obstacles they face in order to implement strategies for social justice, peace, and security. Plus, we'll go behind the scenes with them and be that fly on the wall as they, with aloha, encourage fellow organization leaders to open their ranks for a more diversified pool of talent. Brother Pono is smiling down on us now. One last bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to our first speaker. The Q&A tab is where you can store and vote on questions, which will be answered in the order of popularity. We're so democratic here. Now, without further ado, our president and opening speaker, Susie Lum.
Aloha, and thank you so much, Tippy, and thank you, Sarah. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and our distinguished panelists, and what an honor and pleasure it is to be here. In 1986, I went off to basic training as a private. I just shared this story today with a group of soldiers who asked me to speak on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Month, which is here in Hawaii, to share the contributions of this region who've become Americans to serve in our nation's military. Well, last year I retired after 34 years in the service, and within that time, of course, I've been honored to be able to meet some of you, especially Gloria, who's on the line, to be able to serve in different areas talking about security. But I can tell you that in 1986, no one would have imagined that I would have retired last year as a Major General from Indo-Pacific Command, having worked with Admiral Davidson and Admiral Harris, who later became the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Because in 1986, I was probably very underestimated, like many women. In fact, as I went up through the ranks, and ended up in infantry units where I was often the first. And even most recently, when I retired from Indo-Pacific Command, in those positions that I served, I was the first woman. And taking over here in January as the president of the East-West Center, which was established in 1960, I'm also the first woman. So the experiences certainly in the military that have shaped to where I am today, not just being first, but also learning how to leading in different environments where maybe you're in a environment where no one really looks like you. I wanted to just share really quickly, I know I've got a real quick amount of time, but I look forward to sharing with you just a few things. Just as Tippy had mentioned, being deployed, going to Iraq, I was the first female. And of course, now I'm here with Gals with Lay. So excited to be with all of you. But the other picture you see on the bottom there is me in Iraq, in Operation Iraqi Freedom 3, where, working myself up, I was the first woman to be the senior intelligence officer of an infantry brigade. And at that time, women were actually not allowed at the brigade level legally. It's only in 2015 in the United States that they changed the law that allowed women to be in all combat roles. So serving in that capacity, often people, had to take a second look. So often that required of me having to work harder just to be on an equal footing. I find that very interesting, sometimes when we are out there. But this experience was incredible for me because you see the two young girls there. By having women out there on the front lines allowed us to have access to the population. Access that my male colleagues did not have access. When I went out there on the ground in Iraq, oftentimes children and women would come up to me. And this would take me into a new space. When I went up to 5.5 years ago, or over 6 years now, to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, you can see that picture there, located here in the middle of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm the only female on the top bridge. Admiral Davidson is the 4-star admiral responsible for all U.S. forces from the California coast to the west coast of India. Hollywood to Bollywood, polar bears to penguins, 36 nations, 14 time zones, 380,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardmen. And they've never had a female that sat at that level on the bridge where you have the deputy commander, the chief of staff, and the senior enlisted leader. And it was here in this space where I was able to bring forth and had a platform to share about the role of women and the role that women play in engaging in this region, and was able to spearhead women, peace, and security efforts that I know that Gloria also inspired me. I do have a picture from the Philippines that I'm excited to share. And, taking this experience, I was able to share that, leadership and impact, whether it's in government, business, in community activities, engaging with populations, must be inclusive. And often absent, I've learned, has been women. And I've had the great privilege of having a platform in uniform that brought forth women. What you see on the top here, on the bottom, of course, are some East-West Center activities that promote that. But at the top was the last year's Women, Peace, and Security Symposium run by the Pacific Air Forces. And you can see the variety of countries from throughout the region, which was very exciting to share. And the next thing I've learned that I have brought also here to the center is that our efforts have to be intentional, much like this event here, that engaging with the 50% of the population, bringing them into the fold, has to be intentional through policies, inclusion in the operations that you're doing, engagements. So you can see pictures here in Malaysia, Mongolia, and Bangladesh. I was really proud to be able to do those bilateral and multilateral engagements. Yes, I was in Mongolia. Somebody made a comment, and it was very exciting to be there and to be a keynote speaker and share. The other piece I've learned throughout this time is that it has to be actionable. And that top right corner is after Marari. And I know Gloria had a significant hand in women, peace, and security, and ensuring that women were part of the solution for conflict and post-conflict recovery. And I'm sure she can mention more of that. I think that was a critical piece that I learned from her. So through these engagements, through these dialogues that we don't really even realize sometimes how much we impact one another. And Just knowing that and having met Gloria, I learned from that, and I've shared that story. So when we think that these engagements that are short-lived don't have an impact, it certainly did in my life. And lastly, I learned that none of this happens without intentional education and training. Little did I know that later on I would be here. You can see the picture of me in the middle of our first gender advisor course, which was held actually at the East West Center here, and that later I'd become the president of the East West Center, and giving many leadership opportunities. So what I did in uniform in leadership, I've been able to bring here to the East West Center and engaged at the highest levels of our nation and internationally. So mahalo nui loa. I've already taken up enough of my time. I look forward to engaging with you and your questions.
Thank you, Susie, for kicking us off. Next to share with us is Gloria JUMAMIL. Gloria?
Good morning from Manila. My sharing today would be different. I say this because my three other distinguished panelists is actually sharing their experience of a transition from military to a private life, or academic institution. Mine would be an evolving transition that goes on for many years already. So let me start by saying that transitions, whether in our professional careers or in any aspects of our lives, oftentimes lead us to defining moments. I say this because transition allow us to carry all the learnings wherever we go, whether post-civilian careers, from non-combatant to frontline roles within the military. Today, I am going to share key defining moments by looking back at my prime years, working for the government, the academe, civil society organization, and the military. The first one was during my entry to the world of defense and security, my commissionship to the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the two destructive calamities, which was a defining moment for the reservist, the office of the president, and lastly, the significant role that I played in the Bangsamoro peace process in Mindanao. While doing my master's in national security administration in the early 1990s, I was with a group of young idealistic professionals who wanted to propagate a mutually inclusive framework of development and security beyond the notion of defense. We knew that back then that we need to break the ideology of security as something involving only security officers, police, and military. In fact, we believe that development and security is the highest framework of which to anchor our national strategies. We wanted to influence our political leaders, legislators, and research institutions to understand and adapt the framework of DevSec. When I was first commissioned to the Armed Forces in 1993, there was a loud debate as to how to better utilize the reservists, and more particularly the mission of the Naval Reserve Force, the Philippines being an archipelagic country. It highlights a traditional role of providing needed support to the country's military objective. To understand the organization better, I went for a straight annual active duty training. Thereafter, I always maintained the fundamental belief that my being a good reservist is contingent to how good I am in my own profession. In 2013, through the Philippine Navy reorganization, the Naval Forces Reserve Eastern Visayas was activated, and I was installed as its first commander. The most challenging conditions during my tenure as commander were responding to two disasters in the Philippine history: the Bohol earthquake and the Super Typhoon Yolanda, which we all know as Typhoon Haiyan. The 7.2 magnitude earthquake in Bohol affected the entire central Visayas. Then came Haiyan, the strongest storm recorded at landfall and deadliest for the Philippines, as it killed almost 10,000 people. I found myself in the middle of leading the coordination and assisting in relief and rescue operation. This was, however, a defining moment that solidified civil military operations in response to calamities. We tapped all partners and expanded network in order to have a wider reach of the relief. At that time, I was also Senior Vice President and Dean of the Graduate School of the Development Academy of the Philippines. Instantly, DAP became the command center. In pulling all our resources together, the response from our partners in civil society was enormous and overwhelming. Many organizations, individuals poured their generous hearts in all ways and means. Both calamities, while devastating, also brought to the fore the best among the Filipino people and values. The value of true joy in giving was truly felt and relished by the volunteers. We continue, however, to integrate the development and security in the different academic institutions, like the executive class of the Masters in National Security Administration. When former Cabinet Secretary and now Presidential Advisor June Ibasco asked me to join in 2016 the Office of the Cabinet Secretary at the Office of the President, I instantly felt this was a huge step to influence the national strategy. By mainstreaming development and security framework, sustainable development, and more importantly, to highlight the role of women. The unfortunate seeds that broke out in Marawi in May 2017, where Philippine government forces clashed with extremist Maoti group, had activated my role as a reservist once again. The siege lasted for over 5 months, leaving a total of 210 government troops and civilians killed and 847 Maoti fighters. Thousands of residents suffered from massive displacement, and the city was left in ruins. Post-conflict recovery and rehabilitation efforts were immediately planned out by the government. On our side, we did support groups like organizing the hijab troopers so that the needs of the children and the women in the resettlement areas and in the temporary sheltered areas are responded to. That year, I was also conferred with a star rank and became the first Philippine Navy woman Commodore. In 2019, I was again in transition when I was appointed as the Executive Director of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the peace process. This was like coming full circle because after 4 decades in the government service, I am now at the home stretch of my career working on the things I'm most passionate about. Having a deep appreciation of the breadth of the bureaucracy and with a strong background on peace building, we introduced reforms in the organization to make it more relevant to the current development in the peace front. The only challenge I faced and encountered is working with former high-ranking retired military officials, obviously male, who find it hard to take off their military hat, even when they are already occupying high civilian position in the bureaucracy. Also, with the resignation of chairman of the government implementing panel of the Bangsamoro Peace Accord, I was elevated from vice chair to chairperson, and I have 3 military men in my team. With all these roles, I carried the brand of leadership and missionary seal to serve as a civilian and as a reservist, which makes it very easy for me to fortify transitional justice and reconciliation as an overarching lens in the normalization phase. Meaningful participation of women in the peace process and peace building efforts is what I continuously advocate. It is a way of life. We continue to engage and partner with Bangsamoro women, especially in terms of gender mainstreaming and equity. In 2008, I founded the Women in National Development and Security, or WINS, an advocacy and support group for women inclusion and mainstreaming of security sector. We were able to lobby to hold for women to hold leadership position in the military and the bureaucracy. We were able to successfully in 2010 had our first woman general in the Philippine Army, the first woman to lead a military contingent to the UN peacekeeping, the first woman to command a naval ship and receive a command at seabads. Women became a platform for meaningful inclusion not only in the armed forces but in non-traditional sector. In 2018, I represented the Philippines and joined the women from across Southeast Asia gathered in the Philippines for the inaugural launch of ASEAN Women for Peace Registry. It is a response to the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. In closing, I believe that one never fully transition. We are still at it. The best part about holding leadership position both in the military and the bureaucracy is that it is integrated into our whole being and engraved in our hearts. My role is hybrid. My experience taught me to always draw strength from what we currently have as individual, build on our existing network, and leverage this with the vastness of our resources in the government. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Gloria, for sharing such great insights and visions with us. Now let's turn our attention to Micheline Big Man.
Shodaji, Alasha, Banichuhush, Hook. Aloha. But greetings. My name is Micheline Big Man. I am a member of the Apsalagan Nation, also known as the Crow Tribe of Montana. I served over 2 decades in the United States Army. I retired. I'm also a combat veteran of Iraqi Freedom. I am the president and founder of Native American Women Warriors. We are a 2-part organization. We are a color guard and also a 501c3, but we initially started as a color guard. We were recognized as the first all-female color guard in 2010, and since then we've expanded to a nonprofit. And our mission is to bring recognition to a lot of our women veterans, especially those of Native descent, because we've had Native American women that have served in the armed forces for centuries. We're talking all the way back to the Revolutionary War, but a lot of times Native Americans personally I've seen and experienced have been forgotten. If you look at the Native Americans, and when we're looking at our service members, the per capita does outnumber a lot of the other ethnicities. World War II is a big point in where Native Americans made a big difference in our service, dealing with the code talkers. So Native Americans have been part of military history for centuries, and there's so many things that have contributed. But as a Native American women veteran, a lot of times we are overlooked just as a woman veteran alone. While serving in the military, I chose a male-dominant field, which was a diesel mechanic, and ended up in a lot of combat army units because of my last name, Big Man, because they thought I was a guy. Now all they knew is they got a diesel mechanic, and Big Man was coming on board, only for them, I think, to be more or less disappointed because they got a female, a minority, and on top of that, they got a Native American. Because Native Americans aren't really thought of. I've been asked many a times while I was serving in the military, do you still live on the reservation? Do you still live in teepees? Do you still hunt buffalo? So there's a lot of stereotypes that I had to overcome, and the labels that we as women have to take on those challenges. When I joined the military, it was be all that you can be, and I was going to do everything I could to overcome not only the challenges as a woman, but as a warrior and as a Native American. Native American Women Warriors is also on the nonprofit side is assisting a lot of our Native American females that are transitioning out of the military, and then also give them the opportunity for education, employment. We're preparing them for that, and then also in hindsight, making sure that they do get the benefits that each of them have worked so hard for. Education is one thing that I've always encouraged, even in the military, from my soldiers to even the ladies that we have in our organization. I'm currently in my second master's in law school, and that's one thing is a challenge, but I guess that's just something that I had learned in the military. you take on the challenge, you press through it, regardless of what it is, and then and you're successful at it. And that's one thing I always try to teach a lot of our youth. Success comes in different levels and different facets. Don't ever let anybody tell you that you're a failure, because you're not a failure. You're just trying. Mistakes come along the way. Served, like I said, I served over 2 decades. With my experience, it gave me that opportunity to be that voice. Being a non-commissioner in the United States Army, we were known as the backbone of the Army. So a lot of times I use that courage and that selfless service and those leadership experiences to step forward. We've also done advocacy. I'm an advocate in regards to veterans. We've even helped our male counterparts because of the fact we have so many of our Native Americans that go back to the reservation, and there's not much opportunities. There's not much help that they can get because it's so rural. So now we're trying to reach out with and work side by side with not only partner up with other veterans organizations, but I've actually spoke with VA. I'm like, is there any way that we can work out? We made suggestions in regards to how some of our healing processes are. I said, we're not really we're not known for taking medicines or through the pharmaceutical companies. Native Americans, we heal in a different way. Why is it that we can't do alternative medicine? So a lot of this I brought to the forefront to the VA when I sat across the table from them because of my concerns for our veterans, especially of Native descent and of women, because a lot of times our men are always recognized for their service. And I am truly honored to stand beside some of our men veterans, because we took on that challenge, but at the same time I'm overlooked as one that, and as a combat veteran, I've seen things in combat that a normal person shouldn't see. I was there when the war had started. I lost my sister Lori Paestewa, who's also known as the first female Native American. So she gave the ultimate sacrifice, along with so many other women, knowing that when we raised our right hand, I don't think we could ever fathom the fact that we were actually to be in combat and then face so many things, not only in peacetime, but also in wartime. My experiences in the military, I was also an equal opportunity advisor and a victim advocate, because I'm a survivor of military sexual trauma, which is known as MST. So I use those experiences and I use those traumas not to be a victim, but to be a survivor, and how I can be an encouragement and how I can get my story out there. So if it can help one person, then I've met the goal. I also am a co-author to the book called Her War Too, along with 13 other authors, and giving our experience in the military, whether it was Air Force or any part of the service. So there's a lot of things that I engaged in, and I have to really thank the military for teaching me these things and being that showing that selfless service and that courage. So again, thank you. Again, my name is Micheline Big Man, and I look forward to speaking with you all again. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheline, for taking the time to share your experiences. And our final speaker for today is Jen Whitworth. Jen?
Sorry, Jen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So hello and g'day from down under. But in English, that would be good morning from Canberra, Australia. And thank you very much for having me here today. And I want to say first off that I resonate very much with the comments that have been made by my fellow panelists, particularly around their experiences. I guess we're sort of around about the same vintage. But I pick up on Susie's point about the firsts, and I'm sure that we've all experienced a number of firsts in our career. But what I found about doing that was that it enabled us as women to help shape roles and leadership in our militaries, and I think that our militaries are better off for us. So I joined the Australian Navy in 1981 as a logistics officer, and there was only a choice of three careers for women officers at that point in the Navy, and I thought logistics would, work for me later in my career. But we comprised only about 7% of our workforce, and there were structural limitations in place that really restricted our service. So we couldn't serve on ships, we couldn't deploy, we couldn't actually even leave Australian waters. And so my early career was spent serving in non-combat roles in shore bases until about the mid-90s, when the government had lifted restrictions on women serving in non-combat roles, and they could actually be posted to ships. So I actually had my first and only sea posting in 1997 as a lieutenant commander and head of the logistics department on a Vietnam War era destroyer escort of a crew of 212 and 2 women. And I wasn't just the head of the logistics department, I was also the helo control officer and the nuclear, biological and chemical defence officer. And you could imagine being, 35 years of age and being thrown into this environment without the benefit of time at sea as a junior officer that my male colleagues had had. And it definitely wasn't an easy time in the Navy up until that point. There was a terrible culture of mistreatment of women. Micheline mentioned about the sexual abuse. We've experienced that as well too. And women were not valued and respected. And then I followed that by a similar posting to a shore base, but that actually is where I kind of segued into changing my career. And I started my family. I've got 2 daughters, and I really started to move into positions that were actually created for me, and it was just one after another, and lots of different opportunities that actually enabled me to exhibit a greater sort of sense of leadership and to help shape the way in which we were thinking about women's representation and participation. And it was around about the early 2000s I started working on Navy values and workplace behaviour, cultural reform, organisational culture, and around women's representation and leadership. And so I just continued to build on this knowledge and expertise that I was gaining from these roles. And that actually led me into more specific gender and women, peace and security related roles. And so I was first appointed as a first gender advisor to Navy and in the ADF in 2010, and I worked directly to a 2-star Rear Admiral. And that sort of really was then the start of the way in which I worked for 2 or 4-star officers after that point, which demonstrated to me the faith that they had in me as an officer and in my leadership skills. I started working with the NATO Committee on Gender Perspective in 2012, and that was a role that I held for Australia until 2017. And I was deployed as the first ADF gender advisor to NATO operations in Afghanistan in 2013. And it seemed then that I was the only one who knew anything about UNSCR 1325 and the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda. So I was promoted to Navy Captain on my return, and I led the implementation of Australia's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security across the Australian Defence Force. And I worked directly to our Chief of Defence Force, who's a 4-star general. And I'd really found my niche. This became my passion. It was working in conflict and post-conflict environments and working on gender mainstreaming in peace and security efforts and within national forces. And that pretty much sort of led me into my third career. I call my third career as an international consultant. My last position in the ADF before I did that was a secondment to UN Women in New York as a military policy specialist on sexual exploitation and abuse and peacekeeping. And the build-up of my international community for the work that I've been doing since about 2010 in the gender and women, peace and security space enabled me to tap into opportunities to work as a consultant. So when I returned to Australia in 2018, I decided to leave full-time service, transferred to the reserves, and just throw myself into this consulting work. So I've been working with the armed forces and the police in both the Ukraine and Jordan since 2018, which has been an absolutely amazing experience to work with, women veterans in other countries and other organisations. And most of that has been around addressing the challenges of women's participation, their representation, increasing numbers, increasing their opportunities for leadership, developing gender mainstreaming strategies, and a whole raft of other products that we've been working with to help them through this process of addressing the women issue. One of the things that I'm very passionate about and committed to is mentoring younger military women, and I've been doing that for quite a long time. And that's really what led me to write my book, which Tippy had mentioned earlier in the piece, this Against the Wind, which is how women can be their authentic selves in male-dominated professions, because I really wanted women to understand that they can be themselves and they can lead in different ways to men. But how do they do it? And this is not a book about fixing women, because please don't get the wrong idea. I'm not suggesting that women need to fix themselves, because they don't. If anything, I think our armed forces need to adapt to the different perspectives that men and women bring to the organisation. And as part of that, earlier this year, I took over as chair of Women's Veteran Australia, which is our only registered not-for-profit charity in Australia that supports women veterans. And it's very much still in its fledgling stages. It's only been operating for 12 months. We're still building the organisation and the services that we actually want to provide. But I just want to pick up on the comment that Mitchelene just made towards the end of her presentation around our First Nations people. And we certainly see, there's certainly been socially a growing interest in supporting our First Nations people just generally across Australia. And we certainly want to, do the same thing in terms of veteran support. And we are the only organisation focused on women veterans, and our other ex-service organisations and veterans organisations are very much unfortunately built by men for men, which is a common theme I'm sure that we've all experienced in our service careers. So I guess really I also want to just mention too that I'm also a student. I'm doing a Masters of International Development at the age of 60, and it's really quite humbling to to put yourself in a position where you're kind of almost down the bottom of the ladder again in terms of your where you sit in an organisation. But it's quite humbling to come back to that role, but certainly fulfilling in terms of learning more about the work that I've been doing as a general practitioner in women, peace and security and gender. So thank you very much for having me. And once again, Jen Whitworth from Australia.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your ways you've helped share gender policy and for wrapping up our panel discussion ever so nicely. Now I'll transition to our Q&A session. I'll start by asking guests just a couple of questions, allowing our participants time to get their questions and final votes in using our Q&A tab. Followed by guided instructions to our finale with open discussions for our virtual roundtable chat, so please stick around. Our first question is for President Lum. Susie, in using one of your keywords earlier, you mentioned intentionality. Over the years, how have you built alliances and gained respect with your male counterparts while staying true to who you are in your many roles as one of the first?
Well, thank you so much for that question, and thank you all the panelists. So fascinating just to hear everyone's stories. In terms of, allies and partners are not just international, but they're within organizations. And when you are standing alone, with my first unit was a division artillery unit in Germany when there was East and West Germany, and I was one of the very few female. They didn't even have, accommodations for women. I mean, you just needed to flip the sign or go find a tree or something. So that's just how it was. So, you learn not to complain or make too many waves when you were younger. Now when you're older and I have the position to be able to do that, what happened along the way was building those partnerships by, number one, working really hard, trying to establishing myself, doing a good job, and at the same time building those relationships with primarily men. And eventually those very men became the advocates. They weren't just women advocates, because none of my bosses were women. They were all men. So they provided the opportunities. They were in the positions of power. And over time, it wasn't just women talking about women, peace and security. It was men who were talking about women, peace and security, because they understood what was important. So I believe that partnership is critical. Even putting into this job, not having men, it was a man, actually the president of the University of Hawaii put my name in. So it was other men now being sponsors and advocates. But you build that over time through friendship and relationships. That's why relationships matter. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That response was just wonderful. I loved how you brought everything to the table to them and just said, this is who I am, and this is where we're going, and being a perfect role model for future female leaders. So thank you so much for that. Very critical. Our next question is going to be for Jen. You ready?
Mhm.
Awesome. Okay, so in hearing about your role in the ADF as a gender advisor during operations in Afghanistan, what challenges did you face and what changes did you help to create? And if you can also speak to the protocol fondly familiar to me of the cultural challenges women face when communicating to local national men, being that of the use of interpreters, head coverings, and eye contact, if it applies.
Thanks, Tibby. So when I actually had arrived in Afghanistan and taken up my role in the operational command at Kabul airport, there hadn't actually been a gender advisor in that role for about 12 months. And what that really meant was that internally within the command organisation, the command structure, there was very little knowledge about gender and women, peace and security, despite the fact that integrating a gender perspective was very clearly laid out in an annex to the commander's plan. And I think they probably thought because there was no gender advisor, then that could be quite dismissive of the gender piece. And my experience in working with a lot of the men and women of the NATO forces was there was a very low understanding of gender perspective, why it was necessary, what we were doing. There was the use of the female engagement teams out in the regions, and they, of course, have their own story to tell, and they've been quite successful. But they didn't seem to be able to connect the use of female engagement teams and what they were achieving at the sort of a tactical level to what needed to transpire at the operational and strategic level in terms of overarching policy, overarching directives, and so on. And so when I arrived, it was clear to me that I had to kind of build the gender structure within the operational command. And there were quite a number of things that I had to do that weren't really, in fact, I'm pretty sure they probably said, oh, here comes that Aussie, commander again, and, that gender advisor, and let's run for the hills because we don't want to talk to her. But, they didn't even, for example, think about gender when it came to, developing sort of operational responses to issues that were occurring either, in Kabul or out in the sort of the outer areas. And so, first of all, I had to do a lot of education and training, and that meant doing, attending the commander's briefs weekly and doing, getting 5 minutes to give a quick presentation on what might have been happening in sort of issues relating to women in Afghanistan at that time. Individual senior officer briefings. So I'd go around to all the 2-stars who are in charge of the different lines of effort in the operational command and brief them on women, peace and security, the NATO policy on women, peace and security, the commander's plan for Afghanistan, and their requirements as operational commanders and expectations about what they were required to do. So bringing the annex to their attention. I had to do a lot of education and awareness training with staff that were coming in every 2 weeks and give them an understanding of why gender equality and gender perspective were important. My major role was dealing, if I did have any external engagement, was working with women in the armed forces and the police, not specifically with civilian women in other organisations. In terms of, and so some of the things that we actually did was create the education piece, the engagement piece. We put into policy the requirement for all briefs to come through the gender advisor for comments on gender perspective. In terms of just engagement with local national men, there didn't seem to be an issue with me speaking to them directly. Yes, we used interpreters in many instances where they couldn't speak English, but I was told by senior officers that it wasn't a requirement to wear a headscarf and that I could speak to them directly. Most of them would shake hands. And I think that might have been a bit more reflective of the fact that it was in Kabul, and working, with civil servants and I guess a higher level of education amongst the people that we were working with. I'm sure it was probably a different experience for our gender advisors out in the region.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing the ways that you helped shape gender policy. I appreciate that so much in answering the questions. I know it can be a little bit difficult working around men and being in a foreign territory, foreign country. So thank you for your service there. We have time for one final question, and I want to send the question over to Gloria JUMAMIL, which did a lot of work with the Bohol recovery, with the earthquake. I know you guys recently got hit, went through elections, and just wanted to know the state of the economy and the plans that you guys have moving forward here in the years to come.
Thank you for that question. I guess one of the things that we need to really develop in the country is being prepared, because we're a country that is visited by 10 typhoons every year. So I guess one of the things that we're preparing so well with our people is resiliency. And on the side of the armed forces and the civilian bureaucracy, it's being able to work together for an immediate response and relief operations. We just went through just a month or 2 months ago, before the national election, we had Typhoon Odette and Typhoon Agaton, and we lost a lot of our countrymen. But it was, for the first time, it was a very spontaneous response from the locals, from the national, the Filipino people ourselves. No, we didn't expect support from other foreign countries, but we were able to rally a lot of relief goods and a lot of volunteers to be on the ground the moment we started the relief and rescue operations. So I guess at this point we already mastered the trade of responding to all these calamities, getting all those typhoons every year. And the reservist is in the forefront of all those humanitarian initiatives. We are also getting a lot of support in terms of the equipments and the more of the hardwares of relief operations, because in terms of human resources, we have it in the Philippines. So thank you for that question, TP.
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you for responding so sufficiently. Now it's time for the audience Q&A. And I see them trickulating here. So let's go over to our Q&A tab. Be sure that you enter your question in there, and then we have some votes. So our most popular vote is for any and all speakers. It says, many of you mentioned facing challenges as a woman in the military. I'll read it first, and then I'll appoint one to talk. And if anyone else wants to chime in, you're free to do that. Many of you mentioned facing challenges as a woman in the military, sexism, sexual trauma, and racist stereotypes in a male-dominated field. Can you share with us what you did to persevere and overcome those challenges? Let's kick it off to Mitchelene. I know she can wait.
Yes. It was stated earlier by Suzanne. Building those relationships was very important, and also let them that cliches, don't let them see you sweat. And being female, a lot of times they know we have a tendency to be emotional. So there are a lot of times I had to, prove myself 3 times as hard, whether it was the physical, whether it was the technical, whether it was just the job itself, and show them that, I was very determined to work side by side with them. but relationships was one of the main things that I felt like was strong in building up that rapport. So was it a struggle? Yes. I'm not gonna. I won't sugarcoat it. It was a struggle, and being a non-commissioned officer and being the only female in combat arm units, it was. And then having a name like Big Man and being Native American, I think I had to overcome a lot of the cliches and the stereotypes and the name calling, and letting them know, like, first of all, respect me as a person, and respect me as a soldier. And I had to prove that and stand firm. And I'm not going to say I didn't do it without tears. There were times I had to walk away and say, I'm going to be right back. And I had to go somewhere just to like let it out, come back and show them like, look, you didn't break me. You think you might have made me cry, but you didn't break me because I'm still standing. And that's what I had to prove to them. It's like I'm still here. So I hope that was helpful.
That was super helpful, very touching, especially as a chaplain. I get the struggle and I get the pain. I believe we have Jennifer who also can speak to this, and we'll have that and we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Tippy. I'm also a survivor of a sexual assault that occurred when I was a young midshipman under training. I was 20 years old. And so this is 1982, and it was a time when, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, where women were not valued or respected. Sexual harassment and sexual abuse was rife, and there was nowhere for women to go to report it because there were no mechanisms in place. If we reported it to our mostly male bosses, they would have, said things like, well, you probably asked for it or it's your fault. The kind of almost the sort of the victim blaming we're still hearing today, sadly. And so I don't know where this strength came from, but for me, it was a matter of putting it behind me. I remember actually even just getting up and getting on with my day after it had occurred. It happened in a Navy mess on a Navy base by a Navy person. And I just got up and went to training and I continued with my career, and I pushed it down deep and forgot about it for about 15 years. But I really felt very sensitive about the way women were being treated. And a lot of women, my colleagues at that time, left the Navy or left the Army and Air Force for similar reasons, because they just couldn't cope with the environment. And like Mitchelene, experienced a lot of name calling and harassment right up through until the late 1990s in my own experience. And I'm still hearing stories that women are experiencing it today, which of course is so totally unacceptable. But what I did was I channeled it into how I could help other women not experience the same thing. So I did things like Mitchelene. I was an equity advisor. I did training. I helped support women through the process. I dealt with my own issue. We had a very big inquiry and defence abuse response task force, which involved getting your story out there, having it investigated, getting compensation. There's been a whole process around addressing that for many women. But for me, I channeled it into helping other women, and it's still what I do today. And it's the reason behind my book. It's the reason behind the work that I do. And if my legacy is, I think like Mitchelene mentioned too, that, I've changed one woman's life as a result of being able to be there for her, then I feel that I've done, the best thing.
TP, can I share?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay. Mine is not experiencing it in the military, because I guess what helped why I didn't experience it, because I was an adjunct faculty of the National Defense College of the Philippines and the Command and General Staff College. So it's like I know everyone in the officer corps, no? But I had a very terrible experience in the peace process. I was chairing the peace the government implementing panel of the Bangsa Moro Peace Accord. And in that institution, I was also the executive director of the Office of the Presidential Advisor of the peace process. And there were like 8 retired military generals in the agency, and being the only woman in the executive committee and the one who was heading the peace the peace panel, I I really went through rough times because they would insist on, like, I have to do I have to read all the past the comprehensive agreement on the peace process so that we come in very credible to our counterparts. But some of them did not even bother to read through it, so we always run having problems with our counterpart in the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. But it just goes on and on, that the struggle of being pushed because you're a woman, and I also felt that I didn't receive as much support from the network of women whom we organized at the start, no, or were existing at the start. I felt so alone as the chairperson of the implementation panel, and at a certain point, I have to make a sanity choice and to make sure that what has been achieved all these years of peace building would be maintained or would be sustained. So I have to leave. I have to leave the panel, or even resign from the office of the presidential advisor, because I couldn't move the normalization process because of the difference in mindset with the military people whom I shared the panel with. So that was, I think, the worst time of my life, where after 42 years in government, I experienced that kind of discrimination, and I felt so exhausted. I felt like my energies are sapped every day because I sit with 8 other military officers that have not really taken off their hats as military officers. So that was a downside in my career, but on a hindsight, I realized that making a sanity choice is actually making a choice to keep what was agreed all these years, all these enduring years of peace building. So I saved the process, although it was very difficult on the part of our counterparts, but it moved on a slow pace, and up to this time, the normalization process is not perfected, but at least it went further when the military was already heading the the panel.
Sounds super challenging.
Yes.
For the sake of your mental health and your peace, knowing when to back away from a table
Mm.
requires such courage and wisdom. So I commend you for that. That's very hard. That question was brought to us by Kelly. So thank you. I knew that was going to be obviously the vote set enough as well. Our next question is from Anissa. Thanks, Anissa, for this question. It's going to go to any speaker. I'll appoint it here in a second. And it says, could you share some key characteristics you learned from your time in the military that helped you succeed and get you to where you are in your career now? Let's see. President Lum.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question, Anissa. And thank you all for those answers to a very tough question, something that we've all experienced on those challenges. There is a acronym, LDRSHIP, in the Army, and it's not because we can't spell leadership, no jokes on the Army, but, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. It sounds like, something from a book and people repeat it all the time, but I gotta say that transcends gender, that when you live up to those ideas, that you're loyal to the mission and people, you have a sense of duty and you show it in everything that you do. You have respect for other people, even when you're not showing it. Like sometimes, well, if you're going to treat me that way, I'm going to reciprocate in kind instead of take the high road and show respect even when it's not given. And selfless service. People know. Most men who have those same values of leadership recognize it when they see it, even if it has a dress on or or got lipstick on. That idea of leadership. And honor. everything we do and say is honorable, and we have integrity. When we say we're going to do something, we do it. And then we have the personal courage to stand up when other people don't. You know, sometimes when you're in a room full of men, sometimes you start to get this everybody agrees effect, this whole, you know, the lemmings, we all follow. And sometimes they like you to be the voice that maybe says, I don't know that that's such a good idea, in a respectful way. And then they're like, thanks so much for saying that, because I didn't want to say it. It's an interesting dynamic. Sometimes when women are in the room, you can provide a voice like, do we really want to do it that way? Or you might have the ins to the boss, because maybe, or in a group I found of men where their guard comes down, because so they're willing to tell you everything that maybe a man might not get. So now you've got the inside understanding that's more comprehensive than maybe just males alone. So there are advantages sometimes in that space. I found that a lot as well for bilateral relationships, especially in this Asia Pacific region, where people sometimes didn't see me as a threat. So I got the real deal on how they were feeling about the United States. So it was insightful, right? They might not be able to share that with other US male senior leaders. So that's kind of really how I approached that, was really being a leader.
I love that. And you also talked about in your presentation earlier where you mentioned, I keep forgetting to wait for my video, but you guys love me anyway, where you mentioned that, you know, you were often the first person, but your gender gave you access to places and conversations and areas that other people wouldn't go. So that was so fitting for what you just said. Here we go again. Another good example of that. All right, the next question was put into the other chat conversation, so we pulled it over, and it says, how can we achieve equitable representation and benefit from this policy criteria instead of mere tokenism? Thank you so much for sharing your amazing stories. It's another good day to be an alum. Well, I agree. I don't know who that's from, but thank you in advance. So we're talking about equitable representation, policies, and not being just tokens. Wow, let me kick that to Mitchelene. You have a lot of experience in the Native American and tokenism, so you can definitely share some insight on that.
Oh, thank you for the question. And like I say, finding that equitable versus a token, it's all about, sometimes it's all about strategy. And that's something we learn in the military. How can I go about being that voice? And you learn a lot of strategic ways of addressing that. A lot of times I've had to use, you want to be that professionalism and come up with a resolution. Sometimes they ask us questions, and then you're like, okay, how can we work together and come up with a resolution in regards to being equal? Is it going to be an uphill battle? Yes, because some of the suggestions that we do bring to the table, they don't want to hear because they feel like, no, it might be offensive. And as far as the part I didn't understand as far as the token, that even as a Native American, just recently, we just finished what is called the VARES conference. And it's a yearly conference where Native Americans, entrepreneurs, and those that are in the government share their ideas and ideals and experiences and how to be at the same level as some of the ones that, the majority. And they use their skills, and a lot of them are veterans, where they use that determination. I tell people there's a lot of self-determination, and they always say the squeaky wheel gets it done. And a lot of times that's what it might take, you know, to keep bringing that voice and then changing that strategy. I'm like, okay, they didn't hear me in this way, so let me try it in this other way. Sometimes it's trial and error. Trying to be in that equal playing field. And we see a lot of it today, that there's been a vast improvement to where we're getting there. We still have a long road ahead, but because the strategic ideas of a lot of the people, whether you're minority, especially the minorities and Native Americans, have made that pathway to where, you know, hey, we're getting there. So I hope I was able to help in regards to your question.
It's definitely a tough one, but you're hitting the nail on the head for sure with just staying persistent with the course. Keep reiterating, you know, this is where we're going to go. This is what we're about. We're not going to be taken advantage of or be the poster children. So I appreciate that. Leveraging your culture in a way that's positive without the exploitation. We did have Jennifer who chimed in, who also wants to add to that. And Gloria, I do see you. So if we have time, I'll kick it your way too. Okay.
After Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Tippy. In terms of equitable representation, I think we have to be reasonably realistic and agree that it's unlikely that we would have equitable representation in our armed forces. And it's been, you know, if you look at the statistics around the world, we vary somewhere between, you know, about 1% for, I think it's Turkey, through to about Hungary at 20%, and Australia sitting at about 19.5%. And it's taken us a number of years to get to that percentage. But what we have been trying to do through gender mainstreaming strategies is actually increase the number of women, particularly in the more technical skills that we've, you know, traditionally not had women in, and also our combat roles that we've traditionally not had women in, through special targeted recruiting and setting targets for recruiting and setting targets specifically for the number of women and the percentage of women we want in these specific categories, and, for example, how many women we want to recruit each year. And I think that these are absolutely essential sort of special measures that need to be put in place to, you know, to make those sort of targeted measures to increase women's participation. It's not going to happen by sort of normal or natural you know, evolution. We need to actually specifically do something. And our defining moment for the Australian Defence Force was a review that was conducted in 2012 by the Australian Human Rights Commission that looked at all aspects of women's participation, including their access to leadership, the sexual abuse, and, you know, career pathways. And it really was a shake-up for our military to say, you know, you're not doing enough, and you're not getting enough women in, and you're not getting them in a critical mass, because we need them in critical masses, not just in the ranks, but in specific jobs, so that it becomes more of a norm. So my key message is that it's not going to happen by sort of natural means. Targeted measures are required, and that's the only way to start to bring women up to a critical mass, which researchers say is about 25%, and that's what we should be aiming for.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
And thank you for the introductory statistics on that. I didn't realize some of the nations were so behind and ahead than others. Gloria, briefly, if you wanted to add.
Just very briefly, but this one is very light. I think just like what Suzanne has said, and Jen, you need to establish linkage with the decision makers. Making friends with them. In fact, I just want to say that when we lobbied for our first gen, there's no policy that says women cannot be general in the armed forces. But when we started the Women in National Development and Security, no one was general in the armed forces. So what we did is that we spoke to the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of National Defense. If we need to play golf with them, we need to learn how to be in the fairway. If we need to drink with them, we need to learn how to drink the kind of alcohol that they drink. And then in 2010, we had our first general in the armed forces. And it went on, but it's really something that you need to establish until it reaches the level of policy. For example, when we were lobbying, we lobbied that we can conduct a Women, Peace and Security colloquium in all the CGSC and the National Defense College classes. And eventually we were able to convince them that at least there should be 10 to 15% of the quota for every year admission to the CGSC and NDCP should at least be women. And that's where we succeeded in putting it as a policy in both colleges, the Command and General Staff College and the National Defense College. So what starts as an informal informal reaching out to decision makers ended up in a policy. And that's because we tried to establish that linkage with the decision makers and the opinion makers. That's it, PP. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that, Ad. That was wonderful. We are going to wrap up with one last question from our audience. Thank you so much to the panelists who've endured and answered all these questions and putting their experiences and vulnerabilities out there. Greatly appreciated. The final question before we head to the open chat discussion reads, what are the top practices? And I don't know why my voice just changed there, but just ignore that. What are the top best practices that you have learned while being in the military that you were able to use for your career transitions? I'll answer that one. I've had many transitions over the year and over the last 20 years. And I think the best practices that I've always have been able to maintain were to not really focus on all of the problems and all of the mind sucks that kind of pull your energy away, but to figure out in advance, where am I trying to go? What skills will I need to get me there? What mentors will I need to get me there? And what stumbling sticks can I gather and put in my toolkit so I can build a door for the person behind me? And I always think about obstacles as blades of grass that I kind of cut down and just transmute them into clear pathways. Like I think trailblazer, don't expend negative energy, don't absorb negative energy, and always gotta pray because people make you go crazy. But on that note, those are some best strategies I can tell you. Works like a charm. So with that, I just wanted to go ahead and conclude our Q&A session, and my time as your moderator. Thank you. It has truly been an honor and a privilege. And I now turn it back over to the EWC for our final session.
Mahalo to our viewers for submitting so many excellent questions, and to our panelists for their thoughtful responses. While we have reached the end of Q&A, I encourage you to continue the discussion during open space. To continue in open space, simply remain online and take a seat at any available roundtable, preferably table 1 or 2, for an unmoderated interactive discussion amongst peers. The Center would also like to extend a warm mahalo to our moderator, Tippy, and to our keynote panelists, Susie, Gloria, Mitchelene, and Jen. The Center is honored to host such an esteemed panel. Thank you as well to our partners, Hub Co-working Hawaii, Under My Umbrella, JWI Ecosystem, Blue Startups, ASU Global Futures Lab, We Empower, Pacific Business News, American Veterans Hawaii, Women Veterans Alliance, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Finally, thank you to our viewers for attending this Gals with Lay webinar. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios, and YouTube links at www.eastwestcenter.org/galswithlay. We hope today's discussions have left you with a sense of leadership, entrepreneurship, and inspiration, and we look forward to welcoming you back for the Gals with Lay Forum in Hawaii this August 4, 2022. And for those of you who wish to meet with today's panelists and moderator, please remember to remain online and join one of the roundtables for open space. Mahalo, and I will see you soon.